The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail leading to Tombstone as Eli Dust Hayward guided his weathered stallion, Thunder, through the endless expanse of desert. At 43, Eli had seen enough of the world to know that trouble often wore the mask of opportunity, and today felt different, charged with an electricity that made his weathered hands tighten on the reins. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." "Easy there, boy," Eli murmured to Thunder, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who'd spent more years talking to horses than people. His piercing blue eyes, framed by sun-carved lines, scanned the horizon with the practiced vigilance of someone who'd learned that survival meant seeing danger before it saw you. The wind carried an unusual scent, not the familiar sage and dust, but something metallic, something wrong. Thunder's ears pricked forward, and Eli felt the animal's muscles tense beneath him. In the distance, a dark shape broke the monotony of the desert landscape. As they approached, the shape resolved into an overturned wagon, its canvas cover torn and flapping like a wounded bird. The wooden wheels lay splintered, and personal belongings were scattered across the sand like forgotten memories. But what caught Eli's attention wasn't the destruction. It was the silence. No buzzards circled overhead, no coyotes prowled nearby. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Eli dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the unnatural quiet. "What happened here, Thunder?" he whispered, though he knew his horse couldn't answer the questions that were already forming in his mind. Moving closer to the wagon, Eli's trained eye began reading the scene like a book written in dust and blood. The tracks told a story of violence, multiple horses, men on foot, and something else that made his stomach clench. Small footprints, barely visible in the sand. A child's footprints. Inside the wagon's remains, scattered among torn fabric and broken pottery, Eli found what would change everything. A piece of paper, crumpled but preserved by some miracle of fate, caught his eye. His calloused fingers unfolded it carefully, revealing words scrawled in desperate haste. "They took her. Little Sarah. The men from Mercy Ridge. Find Sheriff Caldwell in Tombstone. Tell him the consortium knows about the mine. Tell him they have the proof. God help us all. Martha Brennan." Eli read the note 3 times, each reading deepening the furrow in his brow. Mercy Ridge. He'd heard whispers of that town. None of them good. A place where decent folks didn't venture after dark, where questions weren't welcome, and where the law seemed to bend to the will of those with the deepest pockets. "Sarah," he said aloud, the name carrying weight in the desert air. Somewhere out there, a child was in danger, and if the note was to be believed, powerful men were behind it. Eli had never been one to turn away from a fight, especially when innocent blood was at stake. Thunder nickered softly, as if sensing his master's resolve. Eli folded the note carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, right next to his heart. "Looks like we're taking a detour, old friend. Tombstone can wait." But as Eli prepared to mount Thunder, a glint of metal in the sand caught his eye. Half buried beneath the wagon's wreckage lay a small silver locket, its chain broken. He picked it up, brushing away the dust to reveal an engraved rose on its surface. Inside, a tiny photograph showed a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, Sarah. The sight of that innocent face ignited something fierce in Eli's chest, a protective fire that had been dormant for too long. He'd failed to protect someone once before, years ago, and the guilt had followed him like a shadow ever since. But this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't let the darkness win. "I'm coming for you, little one," he promised the photograph, before closing the locket and slipping it into his pocket alongside the note. As Eli mounted Thunder and turned toward the distant mountains where Mercy Ridge lay hidden like a secret shame, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was riding toward more than just a rescue mission. The note had mentioned a consortium, a mine, and proof of something significant enough to kill for. In his experience, when powerful men went to such lengths to hide their secrets, those secrets were usually worth dying for. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Eli of blood and fire. Somewhere ahead, in a town that existed on no official map, a little girl named Sarah was waiting for someone to care enough to find her. Thunder's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth as they rode toward uncertainty. Behind them, the abandoned wagon grew smaller until it was just another speck in the vast emptiness of the desert. But the weight of the note and locket in Eli's pocket felt heavier with each mile, a constant reminder that some burdens, once accepted, changed a man forever. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eli Dust Hayward rode on, unaware that his decision to help a stranger's child would soon uncover a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, and that before this journey ended, he would have to choose between his own survival and the truth that could save not just Sarah, but an entire town's soul. The desert wind whispered secrets in a language only the lonely understood, and Eli listened, preparing himself for whatever darkness awaited in Mercy Ridge. The town of Mercy Ridge materialized from the desert heat like a mirage that refused to disappear. Nestled in a narrow canyon between red rock walls, it seemed to crouch in the shadows, as if trying to hide from the judgment of the sun. Eli guided Thunder down the winding path that served as the town's only entrance, his eyes taking in every detail with the careful attention of a man who'd learned that first impressions could mean the difference between life and death. The buildings were a mixture of adobe and weathered wood, their facades bearing the scars of desert storms and neglect. But what struck Eli most was the silence. For a town of its size, he counted at least 30 buildings, there were remarkably few people on the streets. Those he did see moved with purpose, their eyes downcast, as if afraid to meet the gaze of strangers. "Welcome to Mercy Ridge, stranger," came a voice from the shadows of the general store's porch. A man stepped into the light, his badge catching the afternoon sun. Sheriff Marcus Webb was younger than Eli had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was either very new to the job or very afraid of it. "Sheriff," Eli nodded, bringing Thunder to a stop. "Name's Eli Hayward. I'm looking for information about a missing child." Webb's face went pale, and his hand instinctively moved toward his gun. "Missing child? I'm afraid you must be mistaken, Mr. Hayward. We haven't had any reports of missing children in Mercy Ridge." Eli studied the sheriff's face, noting the way his eyes darted toward the largest building at the end of the street, a two-story structure that looked more like a fortress than a business establishment. "That's interesting, Sheriff, because I found this about 20 miles south of here." He pulled out the note, watching Webb's reaction carefully. The sheriff's face went from pale to ashen. Where did you find that?" "Abandoned wagon. Looked like there'd been trouble." "The note mentions a little girl named Sarah and something about a consortium. You know anything about that?" Before Webb could answer, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. 3 men rode up, their faces hard and their intentions clear. The leader, a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the desert town, dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sheriff Webb," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of money and power. "Who's our visitor?" "Mr. Blackwood, this is Eli Hayward. He's asking about a missing child." Cornelius Blackwood's gray eyes fixed on Eli with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Is that so? I'm afraid you've been misinformed, Mr. Hayward. There are no missing children in Mercy Ridge. Perhaps you should continue on to Tombstone. I hear they have excellent accommodations for travelers." The threat in Blackwood's voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Eli had met men like him before, men who believed their wealth made them untouchable, who saw other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. "That's mighty kind of you, Mr. Blackwood, but I think I'll stay a while. This town's got a certain charm to it." Blackwood's smile was as cold as a winter grave. I'm sure it does. But sometimes charm can be dangerous for those who don't understand its true nature. Sheriff Webb, perhaps you could show Mr. Hayward to the saloon. I'm sure he's thirsty after his long ride. As Blackwood and his men rode away, Eli noticed how the few townspeople on the street seemed to shrink back into the shadows. Fear hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Eli was beginning to understand that whatever was happening in Mercy Ridge went far deeper than a simple kidnapping. Come on, Webb said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The Broken Wheel's got rooms upstairs. But Mr. Hayward, be careful who you talk to. Some conversations in this town can be dangerous. The Broken Wheel Saloon was like a dozen others Eli had seen across the territory. Rough-hewn tables, a bar that had seen better days, and the kind of atmosphere where men came to forget their troubles or create new ones. But as Eli entered, he noticed something unusual. The conversations stopped. Every eye in the place turned toward him, and he could feel the weight of their collective fear. Behind the bar stood a woman who looked to be in her 40s, with auburn hair and green eyes that held depths of sadness Eli recognized. She'd lost someone, too. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the careful way she moved, as if the world might shatter if she stepped too hard. You must be the stranger asking about missing children, she said, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent. I'm Rose O'Malley. I own this place. Eli Hayward, he replied, approaching the bar. And you're right. I am asking about a missing child, a little girl named Sarah. Rose's hands stilled on the glass she was cleaning, and for a moment, Eli thought she might drop it. Sarah Brennan, she whispered, so quietly that only Eli could hear. Sweet child. Used to come in here with her mother sometimes, just for a meal when Martha was in town for supplies. Used to? Rose glanced around the saloon, making sure no one was listening. Martha Brennan was a good woman. Lived on a small ranch about 30 miles from here with her daughter. But she started asking questions about the mine, about where all the silver was really going. Said she'd found something that proved the consortium was cheating the government out of taxes. Eli leaned closer. What kind of proof? Documents. Shipping records. Things that showed they were moving 10 times more silver than they reported. Martha thought she could take it to the territorial governor, get justice for all the small ranchers they'd driven off their land. Rose's voice grew even quieter. 3 weeks ago, she came through town one last time, said she was taking Sarah somewhere safe, then going to Tombstone to meet with a federal marshal. That was the last anyone saw of them. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Eli's mind. And Blackwood? He's part of this consortium? He is the consortium, near as anyone can tell. Owns the mine, the bank, half the businesses in town. Sheriff Webb's a good man, but he's got a sick wife and 2 young children. Blackwood made it clear what would happen to them if Webb didn't play along. Eli felt the familiar fire building in his chest. Where's the mine? North of town, up in the canyon. But Mr. Hayward... Rose reached across the bar and touched his hand. Don't go up there alone. Blackwood's got men watching every approach. They've killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again. As if summoned by their conversation, the saloon doors swung open, and 2 of Blackwood's men entered. They were the kind of men who wore their violence like a badge of honor, and their eyes immediately found Eli. Evening, boys, Rose said, her voice carefully neutral. What can I get you? Just checking on our new friend here, the taller of the 2 said, his hand resting casually on his gun. Making sure he's comfortable. Mercy Ridge can be a dangerous place for folks who don't mind their own business. Eli turned slowly, his own hand moving to rest on his Colt. I appreciate the concern, but I've been taking care of myself for a long time. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every person in the saloon seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see if blood would be spilled on the sawdust floor. See that you do, the gunman said finally. Hate to see anything happen to a visitor. After they left, Rose poured Eli a whiskey with shaking hands. You can't save her, she whispered. Not alone. Blackwood's got too much power, too many men. But Eli was thinking about the photograph in the locket, about Sarah's bright eyes and gap-toothed smile. He was thinking about Martha Brennan, who died trying to do the right thing. And he was thinking about all the times he'd walked away from fights that weren't his, all the times he'd chosen safety over justice. "Maybe," he said, downing the whiskey in one gulp, "but I have to try." The pre-dawn darkness cloaked Eli's movements as he made his way through the rocky terrain north of Mercy Ridge. Thunder was hidden in a grove of cottonwoods near a small creek, far enough from the mine to avoid detection, but close enough for a quick escape if needed. Eli had spent the night studying the canyon from various vantage points, mapping guard positions, and identifying the safest approach to the consortium's operation. What he'd discovered had shaken him to his core. This wasn't just a silver mine. It was a fortress. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter in shifts, and the main entrance was protected by a gatehouse that looked more suited to a military installation than a mining operation. But it was what he'd seen through his spyglass that had made his blood run cold. Children, at least a dozen of them, being herded from a barrack-style building toward the mine entrance under armed guard. The consortium wasn't just stealing silver. They were using kidnapped children as slave labor. Eli had seen evil in many forms during his years wandering the frontier, but this was something that reached into the darkest corners of human depravity. These weren't just missing children from Mercy Ridge. Based on their varied appearances, they'd been taken from across the territory. Their disappearances probably attributed to Indian raids or wild animal attacks. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the canyon walls, Eli made his move. He'd identified a narrow ledge that ran along the eastern wall of the canyon, hidden from the main guard positions but offering access to the mine's ventilation shafts. It was dangerous. One wrong step would send him plummeting to the rocks below, but it was his best chance of getting inside undetected. The climb took nearly an hour, his weathered hands finding purchase on the rough stone as he worked his way along the ledge. The sound of voices from below drifted up to him, and he could hear the crack of whips and the cries of children being forced into the darkness of the mine. The ventilation shaft was barely wide enough for a man of Eli's size, but he squeezed through, following the rough-hewn tunnel as it sloped downward into the heart of the mountain. The air grew thick and stale, filled with the dust of crushed rock and something else, the smell of fear and desperation. After what felt like hours of crawling through the narrow passage, Eli emerged onto a wooden platform overlooking the main mining chamber. What he saw below made his stomach turn. Children, some no older than 8 or 9, worked in the dim light of oil lamps, their small hands bleeding as they sorted through piles of silver ore. Armed guards stood at regular intervals, their whips ready to encourage any child who showed signs of slowing down. And there, working alongside a group of older children near the far wall, was a small girl with blonde hair and a face that matched the photograph in the locket. Sarah Brennan was alive, but the spark that had shone in her eyes in the photograph was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a child who'd seen too much darkness. Eli's hand instinctively moved to his gun, but he forced himself to remain still. He was outnumbered at least 20-1, and any attempt at a direct rescue would likely result in the deaths of the very children he was trying to save. He needed a better plan, and that meant gathering more information. Voices echoed from a tunnel to his left, and Eli pressed himself against the wall as 2 men emerged onto the platform. One was Blackwood, his expensive clothes now covered by a long coat to protect them from the mine's dust. The other was a man Eli didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. "The territorial governor's inspector will be here next week," the stranger was saying, his voice carrying the educated accent of the East. "We need to make sure everything appears normal." "It will be," Blackwood replied. "We'll move the children to the lower tunnels during the inspection. As far as anyone will know, this is just a normal mining operation with adult workers." "And the Brennan woman's documents?" "Destroyed, along with any other evidence she might have gathered. The federal marshal she was supposed to meet had an unfortunate accident on his way to Tombstone. Fell off his horse, broke his neck. Very tragic." Eli's jaw clenched. Martha Brennan hadn't just been killed. She'd been murdered to prevent her from exposing the consortium's crimes. And now they were planning to hide the evidence of their slave operation from a territorial inspector. "What about the stranger asking questions in town?" the thin man asked. "Hayward? He'll be dealt with tonight. I've already sent word to our friends in Tombstone. They'll find his body on the trail tomorrow morning, another victim of Apache raiders." The casual way Blackwood discussed murder made Eli's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain hidden. He needed to hear more, to understand the full scope of the consortium's operation. "The children are becoming a problem," the thin man continued. "Some of the older ones are talking about escape. We may need to make an example." "Do what you must," Blackwood said coldly. "But remember, we need them healthy enough to work. Dead children don't mind silver." As the two men moved away, continuing their conversation in voices too low for Eli to hear, he began to formulate a plan. The children were being held in barracks somewhere in the mine complex, probably in the lower tunnels Blackwood had mentioned. If he could find them and create enough of a distraction, he might be able to get them out through the ventilation system. But first, he needed help. This was too big for one man to handle alone, even if that man had spent most of his life learning how to survive in impossible situations. Eli began his careful retreat through the ventilation shaft, his mind racing with possibilities. Sheriff Webb was compromised, but Rose O'Malley had shown courage in sharing what she knew. There might be others in town willing to stand up to the consortium if they knew the truth about what was happening in the mine. As he emerged from the shaft and began his descent along the canyon wall, Eli caught sight of something that made his heart race. A group of riders was approaching the mine from the south, at least a dozen men, all heavily armed. Even from a distance, he could see the glint of badges on their chests. The territorial inspector wasn't coming next week. He was here now, and he'd brought a federal marshal's posse with him. Eli's mind raced as he realized what this meant. If Blackwood was caught off guard by the early arrival, he might not have time to hide the children. The inspector would see the truth of the consortium's operation, and the children would be saved. But as Eli watched the approaching riders, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The lead rider was raising his hand in a friendly wave toward the mine's guards, and the guards were waving back. This wasn't a surprise inspection. It was a planned visit, and the inspector was working with the consortium. The corruption went deeper than Eli had imagined. It wasn't just a local conspiracy. It reached into the territorial government itself, possibly all the way to Washington. The children weren't going to be rescued by federal authorities because those authorities were part of the problem. As Eli made his way back to where Thunder waited, his resolve hardened into something as unbreakable as the canyon walls around him. If the law wouldn't save these children, then he would have to become the law. He'd spent years running from his past, from the responsibilities and connections that came with caring about others. But Sarah Brennan's face in that locket had changed something fundamental inside him. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Somewhere in the darkness below, children were suffering while powerful men counted their profits. But their suffering was about to end, because Eli Dust Hayward had finally found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if necessary. The war for Mercy Ridge was about to begin. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls as Eli rode back into Mercy Ridge, but this time he wasn't alone. Word of the children in the mine had spread through the territory's underground network of decent folks faster than wildfire. Following behind him came 12 men and 3 women, all of them people who'd lost something to the consortium's greed, ranchers driven from their land, miners cheated out of their claims, and parents whose children had vanished without a trace. Leading them was Samuel Iron Sam Rodriguez, a former cavalry sergeant whose own daughter had disappeared 6 months earlier. Beside him rode Rebecca Martinez, whose husband had been murdered for refusing to sell his ranch to Blackwood. These weren't professional gunfighters or lawmen. They were ordinary people pushed beyond their breaking point, united by a common enemy and a shared desire for justice. "Remember," Eli called back to the group as they approached the town's outskirts, Our priority is getting those children out alive. Everything else comes second. The plan was simple, but dangerous. While Eli and half the group created a distraction at the mine's main entrance, Iron Sam would lead the others through the ventilation system to reach the children's quarters. Rose O'Malley had provided detailed maps of the mine's layout, drawn from memory by former workers who'd quit rather than participate in the consortium's crimes. As they rode through Mercy Ridge's main street, Eli was surprised to see people emerging from their homes and businesses. Sheriff Webb stood on the porch of his office, his badge gleaming in the lamplight, but this time his hand wasn't on his gun. It was extended in a gesture of support. "Count me in, Hayward," Webb said, his voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there before. "I'm tired of being afraid. My wife, she told me she'd rather be a widow than married to a coward." More people joined them as they moved through town. The blacksmith, the doctor, the school teacher, even the elderly preacher from the small church at the end of the street. By the time they reached the northern edge of town, their group had grown to nearly 30 people, all armed and determined to end the consortium's reign of terror. But Blackwood had been expecting them. As they crested the hill overlooking the mine, Eli saw that the consortium's forces had been reinforced. At least 40 men were positioned around the mine's perimeter, and more were visible on the canyon walls above. The corrupt inspector and his federal marshals had remained to help defend the operation, their badges now revealed as elaborate fakes. "It's a trap," Iron Sam said quietly, his experienced eye taking in the defensive positions. "They're ready for us." "Maybe," Eli replied, pulling out his spyglass for a closer look. "But they made one mistake. Look at the main gate." Through the lens, he could see children being herded out of the mine under heavy guard, but they weren't being taken to safety. They were being positioned as human shields around the mine's entrance. Blackwood was gambling that the rescue party wouldn't risk the children's lives in a direct assault. "That son of a bitch!" Rebecca Martinez spat, her rifle trembling in her hands. "He's using them as shields." Eli's mind raced through possibilities, discarding plan after plan as too risky. Then he remembered something Rose had told him about the mine's construction. The original silver vein had been discovered in a natural cave system, and some of those caves connected to underground streams that eventually emerged as springs throughout the canyon. "Iron Sam," he said, turning to the former sergeant, "how good are you at swimming in the dark?" The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of madness, but it was their only chance. While the main group maintained position on the hill, creating the illusion of an impending assault, Eli and 3 volunteers would enter the mine through an underwater passage that connected to the canyon's main spring. It would mean swimming through freezing water in complete darkness, navigating by touch alone through passages that might collapse at any moment. But it would also put them inside the mine's lower levels, where the children were being held. As full darkness fell over the canyon, Eli found himself standing waist-deep in the icy water of the spring, preparing for what might be his final mission. Beside him stood Iron Sam, Rebecca Martinez, and surprisingly, Sheriff Webb, who had insisted on coming despite having no experience with such dangerous operations. "If we don't make it back," Eli said quietly, "make sure the world knows what happened here. Make sure those children's deaths mean something." "We'll make it back," Iron Sam replied with the confidence of a man who'd survived too many impossible situations to doubt himself now. "All of us, including every one of those kids." The underwater passage was a nightmare of claustrophobic terror. Eli led the way, his lungs burning as he felt along the rough stone walls, following the current deeper into the mountain's heart. Behind him, he could hear the others struggling against the cold and the darkness. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that children's lives hung in the balance. When they finally emerged into an air-filled chamber deep within the mine, they found themselves in what appeared to be an ancient natural cathedral, its walls glittering with veins of silver that had been exposed by centuries of water flow. But more importantly, they could hear voices echoing from passages above, the voices of frightened children. The rescue itself was a masterpiece of careful timing and desperate courage. While Eli and Webb worked to free the children from their makeshift prison, Iron Sam and Rebecca positioned themselves to guard the escape route. The children, initially terrified by the appearance of strangers in the darkness, quickly understood that salvation had arrived. Sarah Brennan was among the last to be freed, her small hand clutching the broken chain of her mother's locket. When Eli knelt beside her, she looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and heartbreak. "Are you here to take us home?" she whispered. "Yes, little one," Eli replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here to take you home." The escape through the underwater passage with 15 children was the most harrowing experience of Eli's life. Some of the younger ones couldn't swim, requiring the adults to carry them through the freezing water while holding their breath for what seemed like eternity. But one by one, they emerged into the night air, gasping and shivering, but alive. The final confrontation came at dawn, when Blackwood and his remaining men found themselves surrounded by an angry crowd of townspeople and territorial rangers who had arrived during the night, summoned by telegraphs sent from Tombstone. The corrupt inspector and his fake marshals were already in custody, their real identities revealed as wanted criminals from back east. Blackwood himself stood defiant to the end, his expensive clothes torn and his silver hair disheveled, but his arrogance intact. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled at Eli as the real federal marshals placed him in shackles. "The consortium reaches further than you can imagine. This isn't over." "Maybe not," Eli replied, watching as the children were reunited with families they'd thought they'd never see again. "But it's over for you." As the sun rose fully over Mercy Ridge, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and hope, Eli found himself sitting on the porch of the Broken Wheel Saloon, watching Sarah Brennan play with other children in the street. She was laughing, actually laughing for the first time since her rescue, and the sound was more beautiful than any music Eli had ever heard. Rose O'Malley emerged from the saloon carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling beside him on the wooden bench. "So what now, Eli Hayward? Where does a hero go when the heroic deed is done?" Eli considered the question, watching Sarah chase a butterfly through the morning light. For years, he'd been running from connections, from responsibilities, from the pain that came with caring about others. But sitting here, surrounded by people who'd found the courage to stand up for what was right, he realized that running had never brought him peace. "I think," he said slowly, "I might stay around for a while. Mercy Ridge could use a sheriff who's not afraid of powerful men with deep pockets." Rose smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I think Sheriff Hayward has a nice ring to it." As the morning progressed and the town began to heal from its long nightmare, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The consortium's reach might extend beyond Mercy Ridge, but today, in this small corner of the territory, justice had prevailed. Children were safe, families were reunited, and a community had rediscovered its courage. The locket in Eli's pocket, Sarah's locket, had led him to this moment, to this choice between solitude and connection. As he watched the little girl who'd changed his life play in the sunshine, he knew he'd made the right decision. Sometimes, the greatest adventures weren't about riding toward the horizon. They were about finding a place worth calling home. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.